We're now coming to the fourth and final installment of my critique of Frank Turek when he's talking to Alan Parr and providing an explanation to skeptics and critics to explain biblical violence. In the previous installment, Turek was explaining how the Canaanites practiced child sacrifice and this warranted the mass killing of them and the forcible dispossession of their land, or what we would today call ethnic cleansing of the land. I offered critical responses to those points. We're now going to return to the video, and the clip is going to begin by Turek making a point about how he alleges that atheists who raise the objection of biblical violence are just inconsistent, and he kind of laughs about this. And I'm going to look at that section, offer a critical response, and then we'll go back to the video again for two more clips. The first, and second in turn, where he offers two different responses to the problem of biblical violence, and I'll offer a critical response to each one of those. So let's take a look.
Now, on every college campus I go to, Alan, I hear an atheist get up and say, well, if there is a good God, why doesn't he stop all the evil in the world? Well, here's a case in the Old Testament where God sees the evil and he says, I'm going to stop it. And now the atheists are complaining. He's stopping it. Well, wait a minute.
Turek here is claiming that atheists, and it's always atheists for him, atheists raise the problem of evil, and yet in an instance like this where he eliminates evil, they actually have an objection to that. And then he laughs. And Alan Parr laughs along with him, as if these atheists are so foolish and inconsistent and hypocritical. But what's actually going on here? The people, the atheists, or whoever the skeptic may be, they're not objecting to God eliminating child sacrifice. They're objecting to God commanding the slaughter of civilians, including infants, including children. This is gaslighting 101. Turek is trying to claim here the atheists, if he puts them, are objecting to God just eliminating evil, when obviously the exact opposite is the case. They're objecting to God appearing to command and commend evil. It's so disingenuous. And what bothers me most about that clip is just the smarmy contemptuousness that Turek clearly has for atheists. He always says the word atheist with a sneer. For him, it's an insult. And it's such a terrible way to model Christian apologetics that ostensibly is attempting to build bridges to atheists. Okay, let's take a look then what he says at that point.
Then they're going to say, well, look, he may have gone too far. He started killing the children, as you mentioned. Now, there are two views on this. And I know this answer is going on a long time. It's a complicated issue.
This is good.
Okay, there's two answers, or there's two ways of looking at the text. One way is the way that Paul Copan looks at it. I don't know if you can see this book. This is a book called Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God. Paul Copan is the author, a brilliant guy who teaches down at Palm Beach Atlantic. And what Copan has noticed in the text, Alan, is that if you go to, say, Deuteronomy 7, it'll say something like this. Okay, Israel, wipe all these evil people out. Kill them all. And then the next verse, it'll say, and then don't intermarry with them. And you're going, wait a minute. Wait. Look, if you're going to wipe everybody out, why would you then have the warning to not intermarry with them? None of them would exist after you wipe everybody out, right? Well, it turns out that Copan has discovered that in the ancient Near East, they had this exaggerated language to try and show that if you wanted to have a decisive victory, they would use language like annihilate. Nothing lives. Let no breathing thing stay alive. I mean, just completely destroy these people. But it didn't mean to completely wipe them out. It meant to have a decisive victory and drive them out of the land. It would be like, we use this kind of a language in sports. The Giants annihilated the Cowboys, right? Or something like that, or vice versa, right? We don't really mean the Cowboys no longer exist. It's just a way of speaking. So that's the argument Copan makes. The argument that Clay Jones from
So the point there, just to summarize, that Turek is saying is that Copan says, well, it's just hyperbolic war rhetoric. It's just exaggeration. And then he gives the sports analogy that, well, in sports, we say, hey, we killed them all, but we don't really mean we killed anybody. It's just exaggerated hyperbole. And the real point was to dispossess them of the land. Now, I'm not sure who first was really arguing that for apologetic purposes. I believe Nicholas Wolderstorff, he wrote a long paper on that, which I think predates Copan's discussion of that response. And then there have been other pieces to that as well, but that's certainly been central to Copan's arguments. It's an abject failure. That apologetic response is an abject failure. And let me explain why. All you have to do is read the text. For example, read Joshua chapter 6. It describes the destruction of Jericho. Then the text says that everybody was killed within the city, men and women, young and old, and then the city was set on fire. The only people that were spared was Rahab and her family. Uh, and then, because Achan keeps some of the spoils that were supposed to be offered as harem, which, as I pointed out in a previous video, all of this was the killing and the offering and burning of the cities, and the offering of everything was to be a burnt sacrifice to Yahweh. And so when Achan held it back, the punishment for him and his entire family was that they'd be stoned to death and killed. So again, that just shows you the stakes of what is going on here is that people are being killed. But Joshua 6 clearly says that everybody within the city of Jericho was killed, men and women, young and old. Now, if you were to say, well, maybe that's exaggeration, not everybody was killed, fine. You'd have the same thing if you said that the Hutus killed everybody, all the Tutsis in a particular village in 1994 during the Rwandan genocide. And if somebody said, well, not all the Tutsis were killed, it doesn't mean that there weren't several war crimes and crimes against humanity that occurred in that village, because you still would have had multiple civilians being butchered. And that's precisely what is described in Joshua 6. People like Turek do their apologetics by simply ignoring the text when it doesn't suit their purposes or their interests. So you have to confront the problem that an indiscriminate number of civilians were targeted and butchered as described in the text itself. Now, when he says, oh, it's like a sports metaphor that we killed them all, no, it's not. At best, you could argue it is hyperbole. So again, what he kind of fumbled there was a reference to Deuteronomy 20:16, where it says, "Leave alive nothing that breathes in the land." And you could argue, I mean, that is hyperbole. It's like, I mean, literally, there are creatures that still are breathing in the land. But that is consistent, that hyperbolic language or that exaggeration is consistent with an indiscriminate number of civilians having nonetheless been killed by the soldiers, including men, women, children, and infants. So for Turek to try to deflect and say, well, it's like a sports metaphor for victory is just patently false and deceptive. So terrible response here. What you do have in Copan's account here is a mixture, again, of acts that would meet the contemporary legal definition of ethnic cleansing and acts that would meet the contemporary legal definition of genocide. Uh, Now, genocide is, by definition, the attempt to destroy a genos from Greek being a kind or type of people defined in terms of their culture and or their religion and or their ethnicity and or their race. Any attempt to destroy an identity as such is genocidal action. And it is no doubt that what is going on here meets a legal definition of genocide. Turek actually referred here to Deuteronomy 7. Deuteronomy 7 explicitly talks about the attempt and intent to eradicate the culture of the Canaanites by destroying all their Asherah poles, all of their religious iconography and images, and to indiscriminately killing them and driving them out of the land. That would undoubtedly, if it occurred today, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa or some other part of the world, that would meet the legal definition of genocide. There's no question about that. So terrible response there. Now let's turn to the next response that he's going to give us, which comes from an apologist who is far worse than Paul Copan. I have some degree of respect for Paul Copan and what he attempts to do. And I've debated Paul Copan before, so I respect him. I don't have any respect for Clay Jones. So we're going to take a look at what Clay Jones has to say now, according to Frank Turek.
But it was not genocide, it was judgment. and God had the right to take people out anytime he wants based on the evil they've done. And he says, what were the Israelites supposed to do with the children? If they tried to bring the children up, the children are going to grow up going, hey, you killed my parents, now I'm going to kill you. Or they're going to try and go back to their old practices, which were all of these evil things they were doing. So that's the argument that Clay Jones makes. The bottom line to the whole thing, though, is this: God.
Okay, I've done videos before on Clay Jones and I've written on him, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about him here, but I will respond to what Turek says about his view. Again, he said there's two parts um, to Clay Jones's view. The first part is that yeah, he affirms that God commanded and commended the killing of entire peoples, including children. But Jones says it's not genocide because it was judgment, according to Copan. That doesn't mean doesn't meet the legal contemporary definition of genocide. If you go to the International Criminal Court and you are charged with crimes against humanity of genocide, and people give against you as evidence that you committed genocide, they give evidence of mass killings, attempts to eradicate populations, target them, and so on. And your defense is God told me to do it, and it was a judgment on those people. That is not going to work in the International Criminal Court. Appealing to the divine will is not relevant. You could say this, that if God commanded genocide, then genocide is morally obligatory or permissible. You could say that. But you can't say that it doesn't meet the legal definition of genocide if God commands it as a judgment. It's still genocide. So that's just an equivocation and a deflection. The second thing Turek says here is just unbelievably heinous, and we really have to camp on it for a moment. He says, according to Clay Jones's view, that you had to kill the infants and the children because if you didn't, they might grow up and rebel against you because you had killed their original biological parents. What he is doing there is he's appealing to a general ethical principle, a utilitarian or consequentialist principle that says killing small children and infants is morally justifiable if you believe there's a reasonable risk that when those children grow up, they may bring harm to you. Imagine if we were to apply that principle consistently today. So every time somebody believed a child might grow up and present a threat to them, they would have moral justification to kill that child now. That's the principle that Turek is appealing to here when he refers to Clay Jones's argument. An argument, a justification for the indiscriminate slaughter of infants and small children based upon the anticipated possibility that they may provide some threat to you in the future. This is pure evil. This kind of justification for slaughtering infants and children is pure evil. It's evil in and of itself, but when you consider that alongside the fact that these same people argue against abortion and call anybody who argues for the termination of a pregnancy in utero from any point from conception to parturition, any point in there, even often in the case of the life of the mother, they will call that person a murderer. These same people will then argue for the killing of children and infants based upon the anticipated future threat that that child or infant may present to you when they're grown up. That is the kind of repugnant moral incoherence of apologists like Frank Turek. People need to be angry about that. You need to be offended by that. That people like this have the audacity to stand there and make defenses like this. And you know where that kind of gets serious is when you think, what if people like this were ever to attain political power? What if in the United States, people with Frank Turek's mindset were to attain political power, where they believed that they could be morally justified in killing infants and small children of people who might conceivably present a challenge to them in the future? I mean, the possibility of that just shocks the mind as deeply unsettling to me. And that's one of many reasons that people should be outspoken in denouncing this kind of dangerous rhetoric and profoundly anti Christian rhetoric. In the previous video, I referred to Frank Turek in the thumbnail as a disaster apologist, and I think that's a fair description. I think that his apologetics is a disaster for the reasons I've articulated here. Now, to have what I think are far more defensible and life-giving and Christ-like approaches to thinking through biblical violence, you could always read my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites.